If you want to enable passkeys on your website, here I'll show you the easiest way to go and add this. And this applies not just to Nuxt in this case, but to any application that uses OpenID Connect to perform authentication to your website. And it's just a one-line change in your application if you're already using this particular method to perform your authentication. Let's go take a look. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whenever it is that I find you, and welcome along to the channel. So we're going to look at how we can do passkeys on our website, in this particular case a Nuxt website in my case, but as I said in the intro, this does apply to any application that uses OpenID Connect. It's open to everyone. So whether you're using Next, or if you're using Blazor, or if you're even doing WinForms with OpenID Connect authentication, this applies and you can use this method. So what are we talking about here? So I use Azure AD B2C for my authentication method on my websites, and I've talked about why I use this and the fact that extracting your identification and authentication mechanism is a good thing. And this kind of backs up that argument. So what we're going to use for this particular piece of functionality is this innocuous menu item called the Enxperience Framework. And what this enables you to do is to customize Azure B2C to your heart's content. It basically gives you free rein access to the underlying method and framework that Azure B2C uses to support its user flows idea. So it gives you free rein to create your own user flow as you see fit and have Azure B2C behave exactly how you want it. So this is what we're going to do for this. We are going to enhance Azure B2C to add in passkeys. So let's see what this experience looks like from a user perspective. So let's go and log into my site, and I get redirected across to Azure B2C as you would expect. So instead of, and you'll see this passkey option down the bottom, but we'll come back to that. The experience is that you would log in as you normally would with your username and password. And because you're logging in that way, you get presented with the option to create a passkey or not. So we'll assume that I haven't already created one, but I want to. So let's go yes. There's some debug options that are on this particular thing, but what we want to select here is external device, so that I can use my phone to store my biometric data and my passkey. So I hit register and I pick my phone. That then asks me to set up my device. So I pick which account I want to use and say that I'm going to create a passkey. I give it my biometric information, and which unfortunately it doesn't show on the phone screen. But I give it my biometric information, and then Azure B2C forwards that to say, yes, I am logged in. So I then come back to my site and I'm logged in as I would expect. And then when you come to re-log into your site, you hit the login as usual, but now you can select Passkey Authentication. Select your device where you created the passkey. Enter your biometric information on your device when requested, and you're then returned to the site and fully logged in. So let's do a bit of theory here and have a look at this flow that we need to create. There's essentially two flows here, although it's only one flow, but you can see that there's a lot of skip this step, skip this step. So essentially using if else's, it creates two flows through here. So the way that Azure B2C works is it has a number of flow steps, and you can store variables at each step, which it calls claims, but essentially they are flow variables that get stored at each step. For instance, when you're logging in using your username and password, that gets stored as two claims. Your username and password gets stored here into the claims bag, and you can reference those in any future step through the flow. So the first flow that we've got is if we're signing in using our username and password. So you would log in through your username and password. You then get asked if you want to create a passkey. So that's this step here. We then go and try and read information from Azure about that particular user that's logging in. And then we do our FIDO stuff, which would create our passkey, and we would then select our phone as our biometric key store and store that passkey in there. That information then comes back and we store the relevant information about that passkey back into the Azure AD database. And then the last thing that we do is we assemble the JWT token that has all the information about the user that's authenticated, and that gets sent back to our application, so our Nuxt application in our case. The alternative flow to this is if you don't use your username and password and you select that passkey button down the bottom there, then you would be selecting this one. So therefore you then skip the ask to create a passkey because they've already got a passkey. We go and read information from the Azure AD database using the passkey information that has been given to us. We then skip the store user because we don't need to store anything, although there could be some interesting information that we need to store, like the number of times that they've used that passkey and that kind of stuff. So we can optionally store information at this point. And then again, the last thing that we do is to assemble our JWT token. So there's a lot of similar steps between the two flows, a lot of steps that get shared, but things get run in certain orders depending on what the user's trying to do. But this is the kind of flexibility that the Azure B2C Identity Experience Framework gives us. So let's go and dig in and put some of this together. So there's essentially three things that we need in order to make all of this come together. We need a custom Azure B2C policy, we need some HTML pages, and we need an API. So in this project here, I've got all of those three things. I've got my custom Azure B2C policy, which is just a set of XML files, as we'll see in a bit. I've got some custom HTML templates, which is what we've used in a previous tutorial when I was showing how passkeys actually work. Then I've got my API, which again is the same API that I created in my previous tutorial, which I said was going to be a reusable API. So this can be called and used from any site. It's CORS compliant, and we allow which sites can actually use this API to perform our FIDO authentication. So if you want some more information about the API, I would suggest you go and look at that video and then come back to this one so it all makes sense. So the HTML templates are a mixture of the default user interface templates that come from this particular page, and I'll put a link to this in the description below. This tells you how to create custom HTML pages for Azure B2C. And then in this repository, the Azure AD B2C samples, there is a FIDO2 sample with a couple of pages in there. So I've kind of pilfered both of these and created two new versions of those. So there's the initiate FIDO page. Although it's not immediately obvious, this is the bit where bits from the Identity Experience Framework gets inserted into. So it replaces this div with whatever we specify in our Azure B2C configuration. So this is the first page that asks us the question whether or not we want to create a passkey or not. And then we jump over to this one, and this is the more detailed one, which is presenting us with the question around which authentication type we want to use, whether it's Windows Hello or whether it's an external device that we want to use. So this is the page that deals with all of that. So given that we've got these HTML pages, we need to host them somewhere. So you can either host those somewhere yourself on whatever makes you happy. I've chosen to host them on Azure Storage. So if I come over to my Azure portal, then inside blob containers, you can see I've got this Azure AD B2C. Then if we go into there, you can see I've got a FIDO folder. And then inside there, I've got that initiate FIDO, Azure Blue, and the self-asserted HTMLs. And it's worth pointing out in here that if I go down to cores, you'll see that I've got my Smart Melon Systems B2C login domain to perform GET requests on those HTML pages. So that just allows that particular site through, so Azure B2C. So don't forget to enable this if you're going to use Azure Storage to host your pages. So that's the HTML pages. The other thing that I've got in here is my API setup. So I've deployed across to Azure Static Web Apps that particular API. So if I go to that API and do an API challenge to go and get the passkey challenge value, then you can see that my API is up and running and I get a challenge come back. So again, this is the other aspect that the B2C framework will be calling out to as it goes through that flow. So that's everything that's in this API here that we built in my previous tutorial. So there's the challenge method, for instance. So on with the guts of this, let's go and have a look at this policy here. So with Azure B2C Identity Experience Framework, I'm going to point you to this particular document here, and I'll put a link to this in the description, but there is this prepare your environment down here, and this kind of takes you through all the various different steps that you have to do in order to essentially add the customization capability to your Azure subscription. So it's just a case of following these through, and I'm not going to do this in this video, but it's not a huge deal. So just to show you the kind of areas that we're talking about, if I come back over to my Azure B2C, inside here you have to go to policy keys and then create a key, and here you can see that I've already created the two that it tells you to create in there. So that's the keys bit here, and then we have to go and register the Identity Experience Framework applications. So if we go and look at app registrations and all applications, you'll see here there's this proxy that it talks about and Identity Experience Framework. So you need to go and add both of those in and hang on to these client IDs, because you need to go and edit the files with these particular IDs, as I'll show you in a minute. Then it says go and get the starter pack. So over in my repository, I've got the starter pack files here, and if we just go up to the top of these, then you'll see here that it says your tenant. So you have to go and replace that with your particular tenant name and here. And before you start messing around with these files inside of Visual Studio, I would highly recommend that you go and get the Azure AD B2C extension, because it helps you navigate and tie all these different XML files together. So once you've changed all of your tenant IDs in all these files, the other piece of information that you're going to need is back over in the Azure portal in Azure B2C and look up the app registrations, go on all applications, and then you'll see this B2C extensions app. So you need to jot down the application ID and the client ID for that. So this object ID and the application ID, and then back over in our files, if you go in the FIDO extensions, you can go to the AAD common and paste those IDs in to these particular places. That allows this method, essentially the AAD common, to be able to communicate with your particular Azure Active Directory for your subscription. So while we're in here, let's just have a dig through some of the other things that you need to change in here. So the FIDO extensions file is basically a bunch of extension utilities that build on the standard base framework. So if we have a look in here, we've got things like get challenge and make credential. So you'll see in here there's a number of service URLs that are calling out to, in my case, my particular Azure Static Web App hosted API So you need to make sure that you replace these with wherever you're hosting your API. And you can see here that we're passing in the origin so that we can do our cause stuff inside of our API and check that it's being called from a site that we expect it to be called from. So you'll see that there's a number of these as we go down. There's one for assertion there. So make sure you change those. And then also in here, this is where we reference our static HTMLs that we just deployed to Azure Storage. So in my case, it's in the Azure Storage, Blob Storage, and the Fido folder. So there's a couple of places where you need to replace that with wherever you're hosting your HTML pages. And then let's have a little bit of a dig through what goes on inside of this file. So the claims here are like our user variables. So these are things that are stored between the various different flow steps that we have that we want to hang on to. So whether or not the user asked to create a passkey or not. So this is the bit that gets inserted into that HTML page. As I was saying earlier, that div gets replaced with whatever you specify inside of the Azure B2C configuration. So this essentially is a piece of UI in Azure B2C terms. So we're telling it to display a radio button with yes, no, and a question basically saying, do you want to create a passkey? So that's kind of where all that comes from. So there's a whole load of claims in here that we store as we go through. And then there's these claims transformations, and I'm not going to go through all of these in great depth, but these are kind of functions, if you like, that you can call as you go through your various steps to perform various tasks. So as you can see here, you've got something that creates an initiate message. So these are all various bits of the UI that kind of get injected in at various different points, or variables that get populated as we go through, or things that you just need in Azure B2C to make certain things happen, like copying things around from one place to another. And then the technical profiles are, as we've kind of already glossed through, the various also different things that you can do to talk out to external things or perform kind of method type functionality. So jumping over to the sign in XML, let's go and have a look at that. So again, make sure that you've populated all your tenant IDs and everything in here, and give your policy ID a name. And then you get to this user journeys piece here, which is that flow in the PowerPoint that I showed. So every step has to have an order. So you'll see there's a sequential order. So that tells you what order these steps all get executed in, and that's very specific. And then you've got this precondition thing here. So this is the if condition that I was talking about. So this gives you the ability to skip over this particular step if some condition is true. So it's looking for if a claim exists called object ID, and if that condition is true, then we will skip this orchestration step, and then you jump into the rest of the flow. So these equate back to that PowerPoint. So we're reading our stuff out of AAD and getting our challenge, doing our enrollment if we need to do enrollment, so creating one and then writing the passkey back. And here we've got claims enrichment. So I didn't really talk much about this, but this is akin to the Azure B2C connector functionality that you have, where you can call out to an API endpoint. So you kind of have to hard code this in here. So I've got to call out to this REST claims enrichment to do exactly like the B2C API connector function, and that will go and enhance and add in some claims into the token that gets generated. That's for things like our user roles and things like that we can do. So again, it shows you that you can really do anything you like in these flow steps. And then finally, we set up the JWT ready to send back. And here are all the claims listed inside of the JWT that goes back. So we're adding in things like the identity provider, so you can actually see when you get back to the client whether it was a passkey that they authenticated with. If you want to know that kind of information inside of your client, here's the extension from our external call out to our API connector to go and get that extra stuff. And we've got all sorts of other useful bits and pieces that kind of tell the client application what flow they actually went through. So the application's totally aware of how they logged in and what they did to actually authenticate with them, so you can make any additional decisions when you get back to your application that you need to. So with all of that XML policy guff in place and changed, what you need to do is come back over to the Azure portal, go to the Identity Experience Framework, and then you do upload custom policy, and you have to upload these in the right order. So the order is detailed in those websites earlier that I was talking about, but you essentially start at the base, then you go through localization, then you do extensions, and then you do the FIDO extensions, and then finally you do the FIDO sign-in is the order. So what you finish up with inside of the Azure portal is all of those 5 files all uploaded, and gives you a custom policy that you can then call. So when you click on the FIDO sign-in, we can actually go and run this. We'll specify the JWT as our endpoint coming back. Let's go and run that. And so then, because we already created a passkey, and then pick my phone and then authenticate using my phone. And then finally we get to the jwt.ms to see the token that would finally come back to our application. So in here we can see all of our stuff. So the identity provider was FIDO, so it tells us that we used a passkey, and we didn't ask for enrollment, but we did persist the token. So once we'd authenticated, we persist that back. So things like the number of times that we've used this token would be available to us if we wanted to expose that. And you can see that we still get our user permissions. So that's that. That shows that our flow is working inside of Azure B2C. So the last piece of the puzzle is to come over to our Nuxt application. And this is using Site-Based Auth, which I've done another video on. But essentially the whole B2C configuration is inside this server API auth .ts file. So when I come over here, here's all my configuration for my Azure B2C, and you can see here that this is the user flow that I'm using to sign in with. So this is the one line change that I need to make to my Nuxt application, to instead of using that B2C flow, I point it at my new custom FIDO B2C flow that I've just created. And that is the only change that I need to make to my or any application. So once you've gone through all this headache, and it does seem like a headache to have to go through all this stuff to make B2C work with passkeys, but once you've done it once, then it's a one-line code change to change your applications to point and use passkeys. So if you've got a lot of applications that you use, then you're going to see the benefit of this, in that you only have to create all this passkey functionality once, and then you can use that in as many apps that you have to worry about. And that is it. Once you've done that, then as I showed at the start, you can run up your site, hit login, hit your passkey, select your authentication device like we just did in our B2C flow, select that on your phone, and you're in. And that's it. Passkeys enabled on your website. So I hope you enjoyed that. And if you did, then don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button so that this video can find more people. And with that, I just need to thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.